Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? This episode, we're going to examine Anatomy of a Fall, the 2023 acclaimed French drama directed by Justine Triet from a screenplay she wrote with her real-life partner, Arthur Harari. The movie centers on the criminal trial writer, played by Sandra Hüeller, who is accused of and tried for killing her husband, played by Samuel Maleski, in a small town in the French Alps. The film operates on multiple levels. On one level, it dissects the circumstances surrounding Samuel's death. What caused him to fall from the window of their chalet? Was he pushed or did he jump? On another level, the film dissects the deteriorating marriage between Samuel and Sandra and the complex family dynamics surrounding their 11-year-old son Daniel, played by Milo Machado-Graner. The film offers a detailed account of a French criminal investigation and trial. More broadly, it raises important questions about the nature of human memory, the elusive nature of truth, and the complex relationship between law and justice. My guests to discuss Anatomy of a Fall and returning to Law and Film are Fred Davis and Samuel Bettwy. Fred Davis is a former federal prosecutor and member of the bars of New York and Paris. His practice is focused on multi-jurisdictional criminal investigations. He teaches and writes extensively on comparative and cross-border criminal matters, including about the U.S. and France. Fred is also the author or co-author of several book chapters and academic articles. In addition to that work, he served as an advisor to the prosecutors at the International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and participated as counsel for victims in the trial of Chadian ex-dictator Hissène Habré in Dakar, Senegal, for international human rights violations. Fred appears frequently on national TV in France to address issues related to American and international criminal justice. In 2002, the French government named him a Chevalier of the National Order of Merit of France for work representing French interests, and in 2023, Fred was named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor of France, the highest civilian honor for his academic and teaching work. As a lecturer at Columbia Law School, Fred teaches a class on comparative criminal procedure through film. I'm also joined by Sam Bettwy, who's an adjunct professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. Sam has worked for many years for the Department of Justice and has been an assistant U.S. attorney in San Diego since 1989. Since 1985, he's been teaching law as an adjunct professor. Several years ago, he started teaching comparative law through film, and after developing the course, he published a book, Comparative Criminal Procedure Through Film. This book, which is now available in ebook form, contains 400 film clips from 55 countries and 15 legal traditions, and is an indispensable guide and resource for people studying film and comparative approaches to film in particular. Sam also teaches trial skills at University of San Diego School of Law and served as an active reservist in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, retiring as Lieutenant Colonel. Fred, Sam, welcome back to Law and Film. It's great to have you on to talk about Anatomy of a Fall.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks much, Jonathan.
So this film, which has been widely acclaimed critically and done quite well commercially, explores this fall, which happens early in the film, and the question of what happened, and then a whole series of relationships and other questions around that. Early on, there are several conversations between Sandra Voiter, played by Sandra Hüeller, and Vincent Renzi, played by Swan Arlode, who's her longtime friend and also serving as her criminal defense lawyer. So these conversations begin just after the fall, and they discuss possible strategies, given that at that point, Sandra is already a suspect.
So as you know, the autopsy report is inconclusive about the cause of death. Mm-hmm. The forensic pathologist didn't have enough concrete elements. But what we can defend is a fall from the attic window with him bouncing off the shed roof. His head may have hit the edge somewhere around here, you see? Then he would have landed on the ground approximately here. And it seems that he found the strength to crawl 1 meter or two before collapsing in this final position. That explains the blood on the snow. But there are several problems. First, they found nothing on the roof, no DNA, nothing. And there's these 3 blood spatters here on the wall. It seems it doesn't really match with the head impact on the roof. And the judge has asked an expert to clarify this.
And when you see this, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm not a spatter analyst, but I know a very good one. So I'm gonna get her opinion. There's the one last problem for us, that bruise on your arm. It might look like the result of a fight, struggle. When did they see it?
They examined me that same night. My sleeve was rolled up and they saw it.
Okay, and you explained it to them right away?
I knew exactly how it happened. Should I show you?
Yeah, please.
So when I'm here in the kitchen, I bang my arm on this all the time. You see, it's like when I move, it's ridiculous. It happened several times that weekend. I told them that my skin marks easily and I could ask Daniel because he hears me bumping into it all the time.
Okay, good. So as you can see, an accidental fall is going to be hard to defend, given the height of the windowsill. So that's why there's an investigation for more suspect. And you're more suspicious death, and you're témoin assisté because you were the only person there.
Okay.
And of course, you're his wife. Now, looking for a stranger who walks in, kills him while you were sleeping right above, and Daniel was out for a walk is a shitty strategy. Samuel had no enemies.
Stop. I did not kill him.
That's not the point. Really. We have to go through Samuel's personality. What was he going through lately? Is there anything that would seem consistent with suicide?
I thought about this, obviously, but I just can't imagine him jumping with Daniel so close by. I just can't get it in my head.
Yeah, but it's probably our best defense. I mean, if they indict you, it's our only defense.
But I think he fell.
Yeah, but nobody's going to believe that. I don't believe that.
I need a smoke.
So what were your impressions of these early conversations between Sandra and Renzi, her attorney? Do they suggest anything about attorney-client relations generally or in the French system?
I can start if you like. Let's put this a little bit in context, Jonathan. What we learn in the early parts of the film is that it's about a couple. She is German, he is French. They're living in the French Alps, and they have an 11-year-old boy who has limited eyesight because of an accident. And then the boy goes out for a walk and comes back and finds the body of his father out in front of their chalet. And clearly he came from 2 stories up and either was pushed or he fell. And so the issue is, which was it? Did he jump off or was he pushed off by the wife? In which case, of course, she's guilty of murder. And so in the early conversations with her attorney, there's a number of issues that approach an issue that we all know about, namely, does an attorney explore different versions of what happened with a client? Namely, is there sort of a back and forth to determine not what happened, but what we're going to portray in the trial? And as we all know, that's a very, very difficult philosophical issue. It's a professional issue for lawyers. There's one quote, though, that I had a little bit of a different reaction to. At one point, she says, I really didn't do it. I did not kill him. And his immediate response was, that's not the point, right? And to me, there's actually sort of a commonsensical interpretation of that. It's something I've said to clients, both in civil cases, frankly, and in criminal ones, because clients sometimes have a sense that, look, this is easy. I didn't do it. Or in a civil case, this is easy. I know I'm right. And my point to them is that's not self-effectuating. Namely, you can't still go to trial and say, I'm right. You have to go to trial and introduce evidence and make arguments and address the law. So I didn't find that comment itself as being particularly outrageous. But, we do see in that and in other parts of the film address the issue about whether something really happened as opposed to what's happening in court. And that's a well-known theme in literature.
Obviously, I agree with all that. And as far as the relationship between defense counsel and his client there, it seemed very American in the sense that he's telling her it's not really about what the truth is. In fact, I wrote the quote. He said, a trial is not about the truth. It's about, and then the filmmaker cuts him off. It's like, I don't know why she cut him off, but maybe she didn't want to reveal her message too explicitly, but it's all about doubt. I think this film's all about doubt. And even defense counsel, when he's talking to Sandra, he looks doubtful, and he seems doubtful throughout the film. He doesn't seem to be that zealous. He's not like a true believer. In the United States would be a defense counsel who would convince himself that his client's innocent and do everything to prove that she's innocent. He seemed not really convinced throughout, which buys into or supports what seems to be the filmmaker's overall theme is doubt. And it might not seem like such a remarkable message to Americans because we're familiar with the concept of reasonable doubt. And even though it's supposedly the burden of proof or the standard of proof in France, I think what they sell all the time in the movies, and maybe the French believe it, is that theirs is a truth-finding system. That's what we're taught, whereas our system's a guilt-finding system. So it's a truth-finding system. But the filmmaker seems to just attack that and challenge that concept and say, no, it's really all about doubt. It's about creating doubt from the defense point of view, and it's about eliminating doubt from the prosecutor's point of view.
There's sort of a cynical tone to our discussion right now, and I don't think that's necessarily inherent in the process. I've been a trial lawyer for years. I mean, and I've had many conversations with a client saying, look, I hear you. That's just not the way it's going to look. And that's what counts. You go to trial and you don't say to the jury, find the truth. You say, here's the evidence. And there's a difference between truth and evidence. I found by and large, much of the interface between her and her lawyer not terribly objectionable, other than he seemed a bit passive at the trial itself. Somewhat unusually, the prosecutor was hyperactive and the defense counsel wasn't, and that's not normally the case. But, I thought his role vis-a-vis what he was telling his client, made a certain amount of sense.
Before we get to the trial, there's this pretrial investigation, which we see snippets of. For example, there are scenes where the government investigators, the French investigators, try to recreate the fall at the chalet and determine whether that shows anything about how Samuel fell. There's also Daniel, the 11-year-old child, whether he could have heard his parents calmly talking over the loud music from where he was standing. So sort of a series of questions that they try to raise or address in this pretrial investigation. Can you talk a little bit about the pretrial investigations in France generally, how they work, and anything about these scenes?
Both Sam and I have thoughts about this. There's one person who appeared in the movie briefly, namely the investigating magistrate, who in this instance, I don't think he had a name, but he was a man. We saw him interviewing the wife. The investigating magistrate actually is central to the investigation, and it is he who makes the decision whether the case goes to trial. It's not up to the prosecutor. It's the investigating magistrate who, in an important case like this, does the investigation. Interestingly, in the formal text of the Code of Criminal Procedure in France, it says the investigating magistrate is to use all means at his or her disposal to establish the truth. And basically what he or she is supposed to do is find out what happened and to put everything, including exculpatory evidence, into a file. Namely, we want to do a historical inquiry, a rational inquiry, and put everything in there. So, and there's no indictment. I mean, they used the word indictment once as a translation. It's not a good translation, because ultimately what that person says is, I find that there's sufficient evidence to hold the person over on which she, in this instance, could be convicted. So that was kind of in the background of what was going on. They then, and Sam may talk to the recreation. The French love recreations, and there's other movies that show them in a way that makes me as an American, my hair curl for two reasons. One is the defendant often is told, or the accused, not even defendant yet, the person who's being investigated, has to be there in violation of what we think of as Fifth Amendment rights. And also, it's totally crazy. I mean, Sam, there's a couple of movies you and I know about where there's recreations that kind of get out of control. People start yelling at each other when it's not even on the record.
I have a collection of films, of French films, and not just French films, but other civil law systems. Their films depict the reenactments of the crime. They get everybody there who was supposedly there and have them stand where they say they stood. And then inconsistencies arise and then stories start to crack. So it's a good way to get a confession through the reenactments. And I think I would call it a variation or form of a confrontation. It's basically a confrontation. And we see those a lot in films, or confrontations between co-defendants or the defendant or the accused and the victim. But in this case, when I'm looking at this film, I think, oh, where can I get a clip, a 1-minute clip that I can show to the class, which will depict, what normally happens, and then we can talk about it. And I would say this is one of the very few parts of the film where I would do that, where I would take a clip and say, this is what happens. And it was interesting that it looked like the investigating magistrate was setting things up so that he could confront Sandra with how loud her voice must have been, and maybe then, get her to say that they were having an argument or whatever. He was on that track. She was not very cooperative. She didn't like the fact that he wanted her to speak French when she would speak English with her husband. And she didn't like the fact that he was having her raise her voice. But that didn't seem out of line, that he's trying to recreate it and he's going to confront her. But he was completely thrown off because then the boy, Daniel, changed his story about where he was standing, which would change what he could hear and how loud the voices had to be for him to hear them. So that just derailed the investigating magistrate on his attempt to confront. Then he ended up sort of confronting Daniel about his having changed his story. But that isn't going to help much because he's trying to get a confession. By the way, I felt that scene was sort of a foreshadowing of the fact that Daniel was going to do what he needed to do to save his mother. We sort of infer that he's lying now to the investigating magistrate about where he was.
Sam appropriately mentions confrontation, which the French love. Many criminal cases have an identified victim who becomes a party to the criminal matter. In a way, is not the case in our country. Among other things, even if the prosecutor does not want to bring a case at all, a victim can force a case to be brought. And they are parties at a trial, including the ability to cross-examine and participate in the trial, so that there are confrontations where the victims literally are face-to-face with the person that they're accusing. And there's one very well-known case about a rape situation where you see a confrontation where the victims of the rape are confronting the accused. And again, my American hair is kind of curls just because it gets totally, they start yelling at each other in this other movie, and it just seems like something we could never do. But the French love it.
Since you brought up victims' counsel, did you find it unusual that there was no victims' counsel appointed or depicted at all in this film?
Well, the only victim would be the son. And I don't know if there are circumstances like that. What I'm surmising is that they viewed the son purely as a witness, and even to qualify him as a victim, they couldn't do that without either his consent or, because he's 11 years old, someone acting on his behalf saying, as an advisor ad litem, I am taking the position. But that would mean he's taking sides. He's accusing his mother. And I can see how that wasn't going to happen here.
I'm reminded of the last film we discussed, Courted. There was a victim's counsel who was representing the wife, the mother of the dead child. Of course, she's an adult. She was an adult. Okay, interesting point.
I've been involved in some criminal cases in France, and often the victim's counsel are more active and more effective than the prosecutor. Maybe there's better lawyers, but they also have an incentive because they end up getting compensated not through a civil matter, but out of the criminal matter, so that they're really active. And as you point out, Sam, there was no victims. There's no partie civile, which is the French version of a victim participant.
Right. And the reason I was thinking about that is that if the director, Triet, was trying to create chaos in the courtroom, that would have added to it.
That's interesting. I think it would have, in this film, as you said, raised a series of other questions, given Daniel's status as a witness, status as juvenile. I mentioned Courted. I'm glad you brought that up. The film we covered last time on the podcast, where it was much clearer where you have the dead child and much more suitable for victims' counsel. Interesting about your remarks is it seems like, you have this French system. It's, in theory, the inquisitorial system, as opposed to the adversarial system, where the quest is for the search for truth. It did feel a little bit of a hybrid where, although it was still within the French system, it did have elements of the U.S. or common law adversarial system in terms of the more passive, maybe, role of the investigating magistrate and the more aggressive role of the prosecutor at trial, which we'll talk about after.
Well, I don't think we really know what the investigating magistrate did and whether he was passive or aggressive. What would happen is that the investigating magistrate would do an investigation. When he reaches a point where he thinks he's completed everything, he would then reach out to the person who's been told they're a target, namely the wife, and the prosecutor, and any victims if they've been identified, which weren't in this case, and basically saying, should I prosecute or not? And then the prosecutor usually says yes. And then the defense counsel may say no, but they may be a bit more strategic about it. And then the magistrate then writes an opinion called an ordonnance de renvoi, which the judge at trial has, saying, I find this evidence to be sufficient to convict. Now, ask yourself, where are we in terms of the presumption of innocence? And at the French trial, in some important senses, the presumption of innocence has been sort of stretched out during what we might think of as a grand jury investigation. The grand jury is this investigating magistrate who is not working for the prosecutor. He or she is equally available to the defense. So both of them can say, here's what you should look into. So when you get to the trial, the notion is, okay, now we've made sort of a tentative conclusion, or someone's made a tentative conclusion. Is it backed up by the evidence? So that it then becomes adversarial. And we saw here, and Sam's got 20 or 100 different French films where you see people pretty actively involved. You can have some real back and forth. But the notion of the inquisitorial is that the neutral person, the magistrate, looks into what happened.
This brings up the point that, well, Fred explained what a dossier is and how that's prepared by the investigating magistrate and it's available to both parties. We never saw a dossier in this case. And normally the presiding judge would call up witnesses and have them affirm information that's in the dossier, maybe have some questions about what their statements in the dossier, and then allow the other counsel to ask questions. But there was no dossier. You never saw the presiding judge working from a dossier.
Well, there would have been one. We just didn't see it. I mean, the important point Sam's making is the investigating magistrate pulls everything together. And many of them, by the way, are really good. I mean, they're very expert at interviewing people. They take really good notes. And so the dossier, in cases that I was involved in, would be a compact disc with, hundreds and hundreds of documents, really well organized. From an American perspective, that is the baseline record for the trial. So you have no back and forth about admissibility and no motions in limine and no, keep this out. It's all there, right? And so the first day of trial, particularly if it's a non-jury, now here we have a jury, which is different, but particularly in a non-jury case, the judge will say, look, we all know what the record is. I want to hear these witnesses because I think only A, B, and C issues are at issue. And then you might disagree. But you're sort of working off of a lot of work that's already been done. Now, here you have a jury trial, but there still has been an inquisition, a neutral who's looked into it and has come to a tentative conclusion.
And I think maybe one reason from a dramatic perspective of a shorter period of time or less attention on the investigation is Triet wants to get to the trial. We have a couple of scenes and then I think it's a year later and we're at trial, right? And then you have these great scenes which the trial continues over several days. So just to step back, can you kind of identify the key participants and their role at trial in the film and in the French system?
It's pretty clear that Triet is depicting that the defense counsel and the prosecutor are the main players in a trial, or at least in this trial. So as I said, really sort of cut out or didn't show us what a presiding judge would normally do. We didn't see any character examination of Sandra, which would not have served Triet's purposes because she's trying to kind of keep us in suspense or in the dark a little bit about who she is, or wait to hear more about who she is through her own testimony and through cross-examination and so on. So she cut that out. You don't ever hear a juror ask a question. Now, let me just back up. We see a panel. It looks authentic to me. We see 6 jurors. Looked like there were 2 alternate jurors sitting behind them. And there were 2 associate judges and a presiding judge, are called the president of the court. And it was a female, the president. We rarely heard from her, and we never heard from the associate judges, which is not that unusual in a French film. And we never heard from a juror, but I'd say many films do show a juror asking a question or two, which they're allowed to do. They just seem like a backdrop to me. They just seem like props. They were a backdrop to the defense counsel and the prosecutor. I think that's what would be confusing to especially French viewers, that they seem to be controlling what was going on in the courtroom, whereas really the presiding judge would be saying who should be called as a witness, and then starting off with the witness and then opening it up to defense counsel and prosecutor. And then, as we see in many French films, they usually don't have that many questions. They seem to be saving it all for their closing arguments. That's what they're really good at, is making speeches in their closing arguments. And we didn't see those. So really it was just focused on sort of amplifying and maybe distorting a little bit, but making them sort of the antagonist and the protagonist in the story, the 2 of them.
If you look at the courtroom layout, if you take the scenes, of which there are many, where the camera was looking up at the bench, right in front of us, we would see up high the presiding judge, a woman with dark hair, and then on either side of her are secondary judges who sometimes have a slightly lower status in the judiciary. And then on either side of them were the jurors. And one fundamental difference between France and other countries in Europe and the United States is that certainly in France and many other countries, they have what's called a mixed jury. So that you have 3 judges, and in this kind of case, 6 jurors. They will all deliberate together. And that is now viewed as a norm in Europe. There's a 2010 decision from the European Court of Human Rights saying that if a lay jury deliberates and simply comes out saying guilty or not guilty, that does not protect the interests of the defendant, because we don't know what they decided. They could have decided something wrong, right? So that there's a requirement in Europe now that the verdict be explained, namely, what did they find? And that pretty much means you have to have a judge in there. It also eliminates the charge to the jury, the instructions to the jury. And to my mind, that's pretty rational. You know, you have a judge who goes in there and say, look, we just heard the testimony. Now, to find murder, you have to find A, B, and C elements, and explains that. He can answer jurors' questions in real time. So those are the judges and the jurors. On our left was up high was the prosecutor where he sat. The French have a phrase, the carpenter's mistake, l'erreur du menuisier, in the sense that that person is on the same physical level as the judge and the jurors, right? And I think it's quite wonderful to see judge and jurors together. I mean, it makes a democratic statement. But people don't get too excited about having the prosecutor up there high when the defense is down low, and people get grumpy in that. And then on our right was the accused, and in front of her, and they're usually not the same table, is her counsel. And then there's a lectern in the middle, and that's where the witnesses stand when they're being questioned.
The lectern is facing the judges, because they're the ones who ask the questions, whereas in the United States and in common law countries, the witness stand is up next to the judge facing the lawyers because they're the ones that ask the questions. But it didn't play out that way. The witnesses who were at the bar, they call the stand, la barre, they were being attacked from the flanks by the attorneys and having to answer to them on side to side, which also added to the chaos and the camera work of the director, having the camera going back and forth as if it's like a tennis match or a ping pong match.
The trial seemed, I think, to some viewers probably informal. I use the word Sam chaotic. Sometimes a free-for-all with both sides jumping in, prosecution defense to question a witness. You have the prosecutor, played by Antoine Renard, challenging when he was questioning Daniel the first time Daniel testified, probing Daniel's memory. Defense kept interrupting, and then the prosecuting defense started arguing with each other. There's another moment where during the defense's cross-examination of the prosecution's forensic expert, the prosecution keeps interrupting. And then I think, kind of most dramatically, during the cross-examination of Samuel's psychiatrist, who testified he believed Samuel didn't commit suicide, the defense attorney, Vincent Renzi, switches back and forth between questions to the psychiatrist and to Sandra. Sandra then says she's going to respond in English because she says it's too complicated to do so in French. The psychiatrist starts arguing with Sandra in French, and they go back and forth with each other, disputing who is at fault. Then the defense and psychiatrist start arguing with each other about the nature of the problems in Sandra and Samuel's marriage. Sandra interrupts, starts questioning, criticizing the prosecution. And the prosecutor starts questioning Sandra then about whether she resented Samuel for the accident when Daniel was younger that impaired his vision.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry, but I don't know. You come here, okay, with maybe your opinion, and you tell me who Samuel was and what we were going through. But what you say is just it is just a little part of the whole situation. I mean, sometimes a couple is kind of a chaos and everybody is lost, no? And sometimes we fight together and sometimes we fight alone and sometimes we fight against each other. That happens. And I think it's possible that Samuel needed to see things the way you described them. But if I'd been seeing a therapist, he could stand here too and say very ugly things about Samuel. But would those things be true?
So this whole idea of chaos, I think, according to the director, Justine Triet, was somewhat deliberate. I mean, she used the word chaos to describe the situation in the couple. Other reviews have used similar terms. New York Times referenced a dizzying whiplash. A French review talked about a tangle of sense and nonsense. So I'd love it for you both to comment on these scenes in the film, and especially the back and forth and the seeming chaos, which I think struck a lot of viewers.
Well, to me, there's two things that are a little bit different. One is really important and is classically French, and that is here they are calling on the accused during the trial. That's just unheard of in the United States. And, as we all know, you have a criminal case in the United States and the government puts on its case, right? And cannot call the accused. It just can't happen. Nor can you ever, in an American case, turn to the accused and say, did you do it or what happened, right? That happens in France. You theoretically have a right to silence, but the adverse inference is so strong, nearly conclusive, that as a practical matter, you don't. So I've been at trials in France where day one, the judge said, look, I have all this evidence. Mr. Accused, Miss Accused, what's your story? This is the first thing that happens at a trial, which is kind of inconceivable. So that was not terribly unusual that during the testimony, in context, they then turn to the accused and say, what do you say, right? What was unusual, and I did some research looking at how French commentators view this, the degree of sort of back and forth, as you used the word chaos, where, among other things, the prosecutor got down from his table and is marching around the courtroom and is being very aggressive. That was highly unusual. And I think Triet was not trying to make a comment about French justice so much as using French justice as she portrayed it as a metaphor for the couple. The chaos in their life was kind of reflected or enhanced or appeared in this somewhat unusual chaos in the courtroom.
I agree. I came to the same conclusion. I felt that this chaos was just something that the director wanted to do in describing a relationship. And she just used the trial as a vehicle for doing that and stretched the limits on what might be done in a courtroom and cherry picked what she wanted to show from the trial. But yeah, I think that as far as a legal theme, that's what I try to find in these films, even if the director wasn't consciously trying to make that theme. But I think she was here, that was doubt. And I thought that that theme was supported well by everything that she did. The chaos to me was just something else she was using as a device to tell a different story. But as far as a legal story, I thought everything she did was really good on this theme of doubt. So all of this chaos is going on. And so there are a lot of objections being made by the defense counsel because they're trying to stop or get some kind of control. Surprisingly, the presiding judge, the president, is doing nothing to control any of this. And that's kind of surprised me. Again, she was more just acting like an American judge. I think an American judge would not have allowed any of this to go on.
No way.
So I thought that was, again, that was just the director showing the presiding judge to be pretty much passive and not doing much to control things. So it was really defense counsel who was having to make objections to try to control the prosecutor, who was commenting on the evidence. I wrote down here what one of the reviews said: the prosecutor, a shaven-headed smirker who roams around the courtroom snapping and snarling. That was a pretty good description. Just getting away with saying these kinds of things, snide remarks and so on. I thought what was believable, I guess I'm shifting for a moment here, about evidence and what's being allowed. And the objections, I felt that almost all of them were about the form of the question, which seems appropriate in a civil law system because it's not trying to keep substance out. It's just trying to make sure that the question is asked appropriately in order to get a reliable answer. So there was an objection as to a leading question, which I don't think it was an appropriate objection because it was the prosecutor asking a question of a hostile witness. I don't know if that same rule applies in France, but that was a strange objection. But still, it was an objection as to form. There was an objection. At one point, the defense counsel said, "Oh, she already answered that," or something like that, which is sort of an asked and answered or cumulative objection. And there was only one objection that seemed to deal with substance two. One was when the prosecutor was going through her book and cherry picking from her book. And the defense counsel said, well, we need the context, which to me is invoking the rule of completeness, which would be Federal Rule 106, where the opposing counsel can ask that other context, the context can be read contemporaneously with the cherry-picked passage. So that was basically saying, let's have more substance than this. And so it's not trying to keep any substance out. It's just saying, let's have the complete substance. So that's a good objection for the purposes of finding the truth. Let's hear everything, not just this cherry-picked passage. But then there was also an objection as to relevance. And that was the only one, curiously, that's the only one that the presiding judge paid attention to and admonished the prosecutor to stick to the facts. So she sort of agreed that he was getting into irrelevant territory, but that's not necessarily something that a judge would rule on.
Well, an important point to make is that we in the United States, together to some degree with the English, but really we're kind of in a class by ourselves, we have prescriptive rules of evidence, right? And all of us took courses on evidence. We have the federal rule of evidence. There's a rule on hearsay, and there's 27 exceptions. And that's the battleground on which criminal cases are fought. Namely, I want to keep your evidence out and you want to keep my evidence out. The French have no prescriptive rules of evidence. They have what's called in French, Liberté, la preuve, free proof. And the notion is, look, I'm a judge, let's hear it and, see whether, and so the objections are really more argument than objections. They're not literally trying to keep something out. They're just trying to argue, look, judge, this is not important, right? Let me tell you a real quick anecdote, very quickly. Many years ago, before I moved there, I was in France with my wife, and we wanted to see a trial. So we watched a criminal trial and then met with the judge for an hour or two afterwards. And we're speaking in French. And at one point, she said, there's really not too much doubt about this guy's guilt because we have a judgment of conviction from 3 years previously, right? So being an American lawyer, I sort of knew the law on this. And I wanted to ask her, did anybody make a motion to suppress to keep the prior conviction out, right? And what I didn't know, and it took me 10 years to figure out, is first, from the French perspective, what is more relevant than if he's convicted the same thing before? I mean, they'd think that's the first thing you want to know. Second, they just don't have the notion of keeping evidence out. Namely, I'll hear it, maybe I give it more weight or less weight. And the final issue is my French was pretty good, but I used the word supprimer, which has the same Latin root as suppress, right? So I just said, did they make a motion to supprimer, not knowing that in real world, that means kind of putting it under the carpet, sweeping it away, right? So the judge's reaction was, Monsieur, we do not suppress evidence in our country. We use evidence in our country. But they have this liberté de preuve, namely, we'll just take all the evidence and give whatever weight. So these objections, I think, were really more argument than what we would think of as an objection.
And there are moments in the film where the judge, presiding, just sort of chastises each side for making closing arguments. We mentioned Courted before. The French courtroom drama is a really good example, I think, of kind of a contrast in the range of ways French criminal trials are portrayed, a real contrast in terms of seeing an active presiding judge and how that's different, and maybe a more typical way that a trial would go, where you have a judge who's more active in terms of controlling the courtroom and directing the questioning.
There is one scene where I would make a clip for my class and say, here's how a presiding judge acts, in the French system, is at the end when she decides that she wants the boy to testify. And then she directs that he's going to testify. Neither the prosecutor nor the defense counsel want him testifying because they don't know what he's going to say. She's the one that decides. That's more French. And she does begin with the questions with him. And then he says what he's going to say. And then there's no follow-up because the prosecutor just says, well, remember what he's saying is subjective, and he sits down. That scene more French, that whole scene.
That's kind of classically French. I mean, there's been evolution even in the 20 or so years that I've been involved over there. Classically, it used to be that the judge would essentially run all the questioning and basically would say at the first day of trial, here's what seems to me, Judge, to be established by the record, namely this dossier. What do we really need to talk about? And then the judge would then call the witnesses. To the extent that French defense lawyers classically didn't do much cross-examination. And when I started teaching trial advocacy at the Rwanda tribunal, a quarter of the prosecutors there were French speakers. I had to go to Montreal to find French speakers who know how to cross-examine. Now that's changed. A friend of mine, a really good lawyer, wrote a book in French on how to cross-examine, but it's 10 years old. I mean, and they're now becoming more and more visibly adversarial. And Sam knows a number of movies that show that. I particularly love a series that's called in English Spiral. It was a 7-year series that shows a whole bunch of, classic trial lawyers and defense lawyers. So it is evolving, and it used to be judge-led. Now it's more prosecutor and defense-led.
And recalling the movie Courted that we talked about last time, that was a pivotal scene in that film where the defense counsel cross-examined the police investigator and tore apart the statement, the so-called confession that had been given.
Yeah, it's good cross.
I want to talk about Daniel's testimony you referenced, Sam, because it's so pivotal. Before we do, let me just ask one lead up to that, which is the film's treatment of Daniel more generally and what it says about how France treats juveniles. I mean, it's complicated. He's an 11-year-old child. He's both an important witness as well as the son of the accused. And so there's a court monitor that's appointed named Marge Berger, played by Jenny Beth. The courtroom appears to be closed during Daniel's testimony to the public. So just to get your sense of how, the French system treats juveniles in proceedings, anything that struck you about that, and then we could talk about that last testimony.
Well, the French are very proud of how they treat juveniles generally, and I think, in fact, they're much more enlightened than we are. I mean, until the Supreme Court decided Alabama versus Miller, you could have a situation where relative juveniles could be convicted to life imprisonment without parole. I mean, it was just horrifying to me. I once had to defend a documentary about a juvenile proceeding in Florida where the 14-year-old was convicted as an adult. And a Frenchman made a documentary about it, which is pretty horrifying. So they treat their juveniles well. And I think the way the young boy here was treated, he had a guardian who I thought was a relatively attractive character in the movie. I mean, she cared about the kid and, tried to work with him. And then the issue of, whether he should testify or not, I think they would view it as what's the impact on him and what's the impact on justice. And ultimately, the justice part won out, where I think because we don't really see it, the judge decided we should hear this. This just bears on what happened. And so, we're going to clear the courtroom. We're going to be very respectful to the little boy. And then we hear this testimony, which apparently turns the trial around. But that was, I think, a judge, and I think a perfectly well-meaning way of saying, look, I want to hear it. It bears on what we have to decide.
You just made me think of something, Fred, that might be noteworthy. There was no exclusion of witnesses. In the United States, we would invoke the rule, right? We would say that nobody who's going to testify should be there hearing the other witnesses first. Of course, the boy was there and heard all of the testimony. And meanwhile, he's thinking, well, how can I fix everything? He had an opportunity to witness, so he's a pretty intelligent kid, what he could say in testimony. And nobody knew he was cooking this up. Defense counsel didn't help him cook it up. He just did it on his own. Maybe there's a comment here about not having, or a reason for having, the rule of excluding witnesses.
I've never been in a situation where a future witness is going to be excluded. Here, you will recall at one point the judge said to the kid, I don't want you to be here tomorrow because it's so upsetting. And the kid very articulately pushed back and said, look, this is my mom you're talking about. I should be here. I found all of that, kind of appropriate and commonsensical. I mean, here the judge is trying to balance, here's this 11, 12-year-old boy whose mother is on trial for killing his dad. And, what am I going to do? And ultimately ended up treating him as an important witness.
And by the way, in that scene, I thought it was interesting that she said, well, it's not about your hearing things. It's about finding the truth. And I thought, that's an interesting thing. No one has said that yet in this film.
So just to step back to that scene before he testifies, I think it's probably the most pivotal, or among the most pivotal moments, where Daniel's talking to the court monitor, Marge, and he's not sure at this point what to believe, right? Daniel's kind of heard these conflicting accounts. He, I think, seems like a closer relationship with his father before, but in any event, just doesn't know. And learning a lot of what's happening, he hears the recording of the fight that they had just the day before his father fell from the window. This really very heated argument that they had the audio recording of. So he hears that, and all these issues from the marriage are aired, and resentments and all kinds of things. Very powerful scene. And so he doesn't know what to believe. So he's preparing to testify for the second time. There's a sense that this is going to be dispositive. And he asks Marge what to do. And Marge tells him, well, when you're missing an element to judge something, this is what you can do. She doesn't know what to say. She can't tell him that, of course. She says, all you can do is decide, that is to judge in the absence of certainty, to overcome doubt, to sway one way rather than the other. And she says, since you need to believe one thing but have two choices, you need to choose. So Daniel responds, does that mean that I have to invent my belief? And isn't that just pretending? And Marge says, no, it's not pretending. It's, quote, deciding. And so Daniel does choose, right? And he testifies the next day about a conversation he recalls between his father and him when they were driving his beloved dog, Snoop, who's an amazing character, to the vet. And Daniel's father spoke to him about the need to be prepared that those he loves will die and to know that his life will go on. And so Daniel now sees this, or decides to see this, as Samuel's own suicidal thoughts, and essentially testifies to that effect. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this testimony and about the film's overarching message.
I think it fits perfectly with what we saw at the beginning, where Vincent is saying, well, here are three different ways of winning, and let's pick the one that's going to sell the most. And it's a pretty cynical view of what truth is. And that's what the filmmaker is telling us. That's a message. So she's saying everything. And Pat, I think you really pinpointed a really important pivotal part, that conversation, where she's basically stating the theme and the moral. This reminds me of a conversation I had with a defense counsel, and Fred, you'll know what office that was. I was talking to a friend from Federal Defenders, and we were talking about the truth. This was years ago. And he said, well, what is the truth anyway? I mean, truth is really just what's possible, what could have happened. I mean, if it could have happened, then it's a truth. And so that seems to me that's what's going on here, is that, okay, pick a side. Okay, there's doubt. there's doubt. But which side you want to be on, whatever you decide to be on is going to be the winning side because you're going to break the tie.
Look, it's important to remember we're talking about a movie here, and we don't go to movies to see documentaries about legal issues. We go see movies about human beings that we can relate to and that we learn from. And, the scene where this 11-year-old boy or 12-year-old boy tells the judge what happened, where he basically supports in an odd way, but interesting way, the notion that his dad really might have been suicidal. That was great drama. I mean, that was great acting by a kid actor. And they had to set it up somehow. And the dialogue with the guardian, Marge, that you talk about, Jonathan, was really interesting. And I really don't know what to make about it. I think she was not coaching on what to say, which is good. We all agree. I think she was basically saying, in essence, either this happened the way you're interpreting it, namely he was reflecting the possibility of suicide or he wasn't. And implicit in that is that if you don't know, then there's nothing to say at a trial, right? I mean, you can't go to the court and say, I don't know. So she's basically saying, did it happen or not? I think. And the kid ultimately, apparently, felt comfortable saying, this is what happened. I'm going to tell the judge.
The prosecutor objects right after the fact that this was so speculative. And for the reasons you both kind of commented on, the judge says, I'm going to hear it anyway. The way the film ends, she's acquitted and she goes home. Sandra's acquitted. She goes home to Daniel, and they've sort of had this nice scene together where they're going to have to navigate the future, the two of them. The prosecution could have appealed, right? The acquittal in the French system, right?
Well, he made a statement in French. He said, "Ce n'est pas un élément de preuve," which is as close to saying this is inadmissible, except they don't have a concept of admissibility. And he basically was trying to get rid of this testimony and give it zero weight. So he said it's speculative, it's subjective, and it's not real evidence. But it came in. But I think you made an important point, Jonathan. Any acquittal in a French trial court, by and large, can be appealed by the prosecutor. And in a jury trial case, it gets appealed to, believe it or not, an appellate jury. So there'll be another jury with 3 more jurors. I think there are 6 jurors plus alternates here. You'd go up with, there'd be 3 judges and 9 jurors. And it's not like you try the whole case over again, but you sort of do. But the prosecutor can say the first people got it wrong. He now knows about this kid, so it's not a surprise anymore. He can be better prepared and deal with it one way or another. So, in a real live world, this would not be over.
So we can have anatomy of an appeal will be the, if Triet
Yeah.
I was trying to think about some influence on the film and on the director and writers. I think the title is taken from Anatomy of a Murder, right? With the 1959 classic courtroom drama directed by Otto Preminger, which I think was about questioning the premise of trials as a search for the truth. It's also, I think, the classic or a classic reasonable doubt movie from the American perspective. So that's one possibility. Justine Triet also said herself, she had an obsession with staging a person being tried in a foreign land. And there's a lot made, a little bit inside court, especially outside of court, about how Sandra is German, Samuel was French, and English was their language. Sandra describes it in one of the scenes as like a middle ground for them. She also said she was obsessed, Justine Triet said she was obsessed with Amanda Knox and other examples that were in the news, women who tried to get away from home and have other things that come into play in the tribunal. So thoughts on possible influences or comparisons?
I haven't seen Anatomy of Murder for a while. I didn't get a chance to watch it again. My dim recollection is that James Stewart plays sort of a heroic defense counsel, and that there's a genre of American movies. I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the best known, where the defense counsel saves the day, or tries to at least. There probably are parallels. One thing that's interesting is whether the fact that the character is German was supposed to be terribly relevant. And I didn't really get that sense. I didn't get the sense that the character thought she was discriminated against, or that we're supposed to think that she was discriminated against because she wasn't French. And I just didn't see anything of that in the movie. I thought that they allowed her to speak. It's actually an important element of the European Convention on Human Rights that you only be tried in a language you understand. And she more than once said, I speak French but not well, so let me speak in English. And they accommodated her on that. But I don't know whether, Sam or Jonathan, whether you took away from it the notion that the fact of her Germanness was really all that important. I thought it was important to the couple's relationship, because they talked about, we don't even speak our own languages. We speak this English as a common language. So I thought that was very, very important. But I didn't get a sense that the foreignness was really an element in the trial.
No, I didn't. I know I read the interviews that Triet did, and she was trying to use it. She thought that use of language and misunderstandings due to language and conflicting language were somehow something she wanted to use to get her theme across, but it really didn't resonate with me. And I didn't see anything remarkable about that.
I agree with you completely that in the relationship between her and Samuel, right, the idea that she had been brought to his country, to this ski chalet outside of Grenoble, somewhere in the sticks, as much as you can have that in France, was, a big issue in terms of the resentment and the sort of balance of power and issues in the couple. But in the trial, it didn't come across. First of all, Sandra Hüeller speaks French. I'm not a good enough judge to know how good her French was. She speaks well. She decided to switch into English for certain moments where she really wanted to articulate herself better, but she understood everything and she spoke. So I think if the director wanted to make foreignness a point in the trial more, I think to make a stronger choice, someone who really didn't speak French at all.
No, she speaks French for a bit of the trial. Struck me as having a quite good accent. She seemed to speak it very well.
So, Sam, Fred, anything else that struck you from a comparative perspective or a lens into French criminal justice from the film?
Well, there's the issue of expert testimony, and there's a lot of it that we saw some of, namely the splattering of the blood and, analysis of whether this could have been merely a fall or whether he was hit by a blunt instrument before. And the French traditionally have had a view of experts that is antithetical to the notion of the battle of experts, the way we have. Their view is that, look, if two people have different expert opinions, one of them's wrong. And my role as a judge is to pick which one is right, and then we'll hear that person. And the problem with that is that, it's just not that simple. And I had a big case tried in France where we ended up winning on an issue of causation, a criminal case. But at the trial, the prosecutor took the position, here is a state authorized expert, a person who's told he is an expert by the state. You're paying him, so he can't be an expert. And so they took the position that we couldn't even put what you and I would think of as expert proof on. And we ended up getting that. We had an appeal where that ended up being differently. And that is changing in France. But the notion of expert testimony, they give a lot of emphasis to that, but they tend to think experts are the people who went to the right schools and had the right credentials. And they don't really have a Daubert test where a judge can make this kind of determination.
I just would note that the prosecutor seemed pretty unprepared on cross-examining the expert the defense counsel put up, and she did a pretty convincing job. I mean, they portrayed her as pretty convincing and confident about her opinion. And the prosecutor just did kind of a lame attempt to suggest that even though she thought it was highly improbable that it was a murder, that it's possible, though, isn't it possible? And she said something humorous about, well, it's possible that someday I'll be the president of France. And then he did it again after she made a good point, and he said, but possible, right? I thought that was kind of a cheap shot. We see it all the time in our system too, where someone will say that to an expert, but it's possible. You can't say it's impossible. But that's really contrary to what his burden is. His burden isn't to prove what's possible. It's supposedly to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what happened.
Ultimately, Jonathan, I think this is not a movie about justice. And it's really a movie about the human condition and the relationship between these very well portrayed people, particularly, obviously, the wife, who we see a lot. And I think that Triet used the justice system as a metaphor, as a background, as sort of a model to measure against. And that's what the movie's about. I think it shows a lot of things about the French system, much of which the French audience would assume. I mean, they would all know that there has been an investigating magistrate. They would all know that there's no rules of evidence and that there will be an appeal. So it's not about that. That's just kind of part of what we're watching. But I think the core of the movie, and man, I watched it a second time to prepare for this. It is, wow, it's excruciating. When that little kid testifies, man, got me listening. But it's really about that rather than about the law.
And I don't think that a French audience would necessarily lose confidence in their system from watching this film. They might be a little jarred by the message that a trial is not about finding the truth, because that might upset them a little. Otherwise, I don't think that they were pointing to any systemic problem with their justice system.
I agree with both of you. And it's helpful just to discuss kind of some baseline norms and presumptions and procedures that Triet is kind of using for the films. I think certain things by a French audience would just be kind of taken for granted or assumed, and then she just dramatizes them or uses them as the basis for her drama, but they seem, I think, particularly strange, or may seem strange to a U.S. audience. It's certainly a stylized version of a French criminal trial to pursue larger goals. And I think that's true, though, with a lot of American courtroom movies, too, that some of them are directed at the legal system, but some of them are just to explore larger issues. Fred, Sam, it's been great to have you both on again. I loved having you back on Law and Film to talk about this movie, which I think is just a very powerful, gripping drama. And I think your insights really help bring out a lot of the key themes from the movie.
Well, it's a real pleasure.
Thanks very much. It was a lot of fun, and it made me think of things I hadn't thought about when I prepared.